One evening back in 1907, two of the most important men in British shipping met in this house in London's Belgrave Square. The host was Lord Pirrie, chairman of Harland and Wolff, the famous Belfast shipbuilders. His guest was J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line and president of the recently formed International Mercantile Marine, an American conglomerate owned by the multimillionaire banker J.P. Morgan. At this time, the White Star Line was engaged in the fiercest competition for passengers on the North Atlantic service. The trade largely consisted of the super-rich commuting to and from America and the rising tide of European migrants heading for the New World. By 1907, the White Star Line, renowned for the size and opulence of its vessels, if not their speed, was facing a serious challenge from Cunard. The British government had given Cunard a subsidy to build and operate two new liners that would outclass all the competition. They would be the largest and fastest passenger ships ever built up to that time. They would be called Lusitania and Mauretania. Ismay and Pirrie needed to act immediately to counter this potentially damaging development. And so it was that around that Belgrave Square dinner table, the concept of the Olympic-class liner was born. Pirrie would build Ismay 3 giant liners, half as big again as the new Cunarders, and provide unprecedented luxury and innovation. The relationship between Harland and Wolff, the shipbuilder, and White Star Line, the operator, was cosy to say the least. All White Star's ships were built by Harland and Wolff, and in return they never built a ship for a White Star competitor. The two chairmen, Pirrie and Ismay, sat on the boards of each other's companies, their interests inextricably linked. Work on the design of the Olympic-class ships started here, in the drawing office at the Queen's Island shipyard in Belfast. Alexander Carlyle, managing director of Harland and Wolff, was nominally responsible for the design, but it was very much Pirrie's personal project. Given the cosy relationship between builder and operator, it comes as no surprise to learn that the ships would be built on a cost-plus basis. No contracted price, just build them at whatever cost, then add the profit margin. It seems incredible to us in today's world, but that's how it was done. The first and second of the trio of massive ships, given yard numbers 400 and 401, were to be named Olympic and Titanic. The Olympic-class ships, although very large, were in fact rather conventional in both concept and construction. Really just larger versions of a previous generation of White Star liners. They employed the box-section hull, 10-to-1 length-to-beam ratio, and large bilge keels, which were the yard's trademarks. To be sure, there were many innovations to attract the wealthy and discerning. Electric lifts, telephones, Turkish baths, a heated indoor swimming pool, and a state-of-the-art mechanized gymnasium, to mention just a few. However, two design features would emerge as hugely significant in the events which would follow. The 900-foot hulls were divided into 16 compartments, each of which could be made watertight by closing steel doors in the bulkheads. These doors could be closed locally, by switches on the bridge, or automatically in the event of flooding. The watertight subdivisions should have made the hulls virtually unsinkable. But the bulkheads didn't extend very far upwards. This design decision was consciously made so as not to interfere with the spacious passenger areas higher in the ships. It was calculated that even if 3 of the largest compartments were flooded, the ship would still float. The second innovative design feature was the use of the Welin patent davits for handling the lifeboats. Unlike the traditional davit, the Welin had a geared quadrant and was able to lower a number of lifeboats one after another. It meant, in theory at least, that the ships could carry lifeboats sufficient for every person on board. The use of the Welin davit anticipated a revision of the Board of Trade rules for the provision of life-saving equipment in the latest generation of huge liners. As it turned out, there was no revision of these rules in time to prevent tragedy. Although half as big again as the Cunardas, Lusitania and Mauretania, the Olympic ships had engines of fairly modest power output, 46,000 horsepower compared to Cunard's 70,000. This reflects the decision to put comfort and stability before high speed. Whereas Cunard had employed 4 state-of-the-art Parsons steam turbines, each driving its own propeller shaft, the White Star opted for 2 rather old-fashioned reciprocating engines, one driving each wing propeller and a single low-pressure turbine driving the center propeller. This triple screw arrangement was considered to be very economical. The center turbine powered by steam exhausted from the reciprocating engines. In reality, it was already an outmoded propulsion system, not only less powerful than the all-turbine arrangement, but less efficient too. Where the new White Star ships did improve on their Cunard rivals was in the matter of comfort, stability, and an almost complete lack of engine vibration. The Cunardas might dash along at 27 knots, but the Olympic-class ships sailed more sedately at 22 knots. In view of what was in store, perhaps that's just as well. This vast open space is all that now remains of the 2 slipways specially constructed for the building of the Olympic-class ships. No shipyard had ever attempted to build such large ships, and it required some impressive infrastructure. The new slips, known as numbers 2 and 3, were to be spanned by a huge gantry from which frames and plates could be craned into place. The contract for building this gantry went to William Arrol and Company of Glasgow. William Arrol knew a thing or two about the construction of such enormous structures. He built the famous Forth Bridge and London's iconic Tower Bridge. The great Arrol gantry remained a Belfast landmark for over 60 years, until demolished in the 1970s. The keel of Olympic was laid on the 16th of December 1908, and just over 3 months later, Titanic's keel was laid on the adjacent slip. As the mighty hulls gradually took shape, the foundry produced enormous castings of awe-inspiring size and complexity. In the engine shop, work commenced on the 4-cylinder triple-expansion steam engines, which would drive the wing propellers. At 5 stories high and weighing nearly 200 tons each, they remain among the largest marine steam engines ever built. The boiler shop produced 29 boilers for each ship, 24 double-enders with 6 furnaces each, and 5 single-enders with 3 furnaces each. 159 furnaces per ship, and each to be hand-fired with shovel and slice. On the 20th of October 1910, Olympic, watched by a large crowd of invited guests and shipyard workers, slid gracefully down the ways into the River Lagan. Once completely afloat, the pristine hull was blown against the harbour wall, causing some superficial damage, the first in a series of scrapes and incidents which would dog the early life of this pioneer vessel. During the following 6 months, Olympic would be fitted out, while the hull of her younger sister reached completion. On the very last day of May 1911, the shipyard staged a show that would delight the world. They launched the Titanic and then conveyed the elite of the invited guests back to Liverpool in the brand new Olympic, handed over to the White Star Line that very day. A PR stunt to match any staged in our modern media-conscious world. The 18,000 workers in the shipyard were given a day's holiday to enjoy the spectacle. They were not, however, paid for the day. After the brief call at Liverpool, where the new superliner was open for public inspection, entrance charges to charity, Olympic sailed on to Southampton. Never had a ship been the subject of more praise and adulation. Amid strident fanfares of publicity, she departed from Southampton on the 14th of June, bound for Cherbourg, Queenstown, and New York on her maiden voyage. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the line, was aboard with his wife. He sent a Marconigram to Lord Pirrie saying, "Olympic is a marvel and has given unbounded satisfaction. Once again accept my warmest and most sincere congratulations." The euphoria surrounding Olympic would not last long. 4 months later, while Titanic was still fitting out in Belfast, she set sail from Southampton on another westbound crossing. In command was Captain E.J. Smith, Commodore of the White Star Line, assisted by Mr. Bower, a Trinity House pilot. At the southern exit from Southampton Water, the ship slowed to make the tricky turns that would bring her around the Bramble and into Cowes Roads. A Royal Navy cruiser, HMS Hawke, was seen heading towards Portsmouth from the west. Confusion over headings and intended courses was exacerbated by a strong suction current generated by Olympic's massive displacement as the two ships drew near to each other. In the closing moments, the Hawke's steering jammed. The inevitable collision caused severe damage to both ships. Olympic's voyage was cancelled, and she returned to Belfast for extensive repairs. Back at the shipyard, work on Titanic had to be suspended, and her place in the graving dock given up to Olympic. It was an expensive setback for White Star. The first superliner out of service and completion of the second now delayed. Some of Titanic's machinery, like the starboard side crankshaft, had to be cannibalized for the Olympic repair. Early in 1912, the newly repaired Olympic was in trouble again. Her portside propeller had broken in mid-Atlantic, resulting in yet another Belfast trip. Again, completion of Titanic was delayed. The two sisters could be seen side by side for the last time. At 6 a.m. on the morning of the 2nd of April 1912, Titanic left the Queen's Island shipyard for her trials. Tugs manoeuvred her out into Belfast Lough, slipped their lines, and the great ship headed for the open sea. She steamed as far as the Isle of Man, swung her compasses, performed her turning circles, and 12 hours later was back in Belfast. Everything had gone without a hitch in what must stand for all time as the shortest and most perfunctory of sea trials. Shortly after 6 p.m. that same day, Titanic sailed for Southampton, under the command of Captain Edward J. Smith, and with a complement of officers largely transferred from Olympic. Captain Smith, known by all as E.J., was the obvious choice. As White Star's senior commander, he had taken Olympic on her maiden voyage the previous year. A sociable and popular captain, especially among the millionaire elite, E.J. Smith was, nevertheless, a bit of a chancer. Over the years he'd been involved in a number of scrapes, groundings and near misses, the most recent of which was the disastrous collision with HMS Hawke. For the week before sailing day, Titanic was berthed in the Ocean Dock at Southampton. Originally known as the White Star Dock, it was actually built by the London and South Western Railway to accommodate the new Olympic-class liners. During this hectic week, the new ship was coaled, victualled, and inspected by the Board of Trade Surveyor. And while all this was going on, a small party of men from the shipyard, known as the Guarantee Group, and led by Tom Andrews, Lord Pirrie's nephew, was still busy finishing off the interior details. Everything seemed to be rushed, and this is not too difficult to explain. The Hawke collision had seriously damaged Olympic and delayed the completion of Titanic. The White Star Line was losing money by the day, and it hurt. To add to an already fraught situation, Britain was in the grip of a national coal strike. Titanic would need to bunker around 6,000 tons for the maiden voyage, and the only way to get this quantity was to take coal out of other liners, like the Oceanic and New York, which were laid up for the duration. This meant double handling of the coal, a dirty and very laborious business. In the midst of this mayhem, Titanic was keeping a dark secret. The coal in the bottom of bunker number 6 was on fire, and had been since they left Belfast. This potentially devastating situation was certainly never revealed to the Board of Trade Surveyor. Had he known, the ship would never have been given a certificate of clearance to sail. On Tuesday, the 9th of April, Tom Andrews wrote a letter to his uncle, saying, "I think she'll do the old firm credit when we sail tomorrow." Neither Andrews nor any of the Guarantee Group would ever see Belfast again. Just after noon the following day, Titanic sailed. Unlike Olympic's departure the previous summer, it began as a low-key affair. However, as the great ship was inched out of the dock, something dramatic occurred. The displacement of the huge hull tore the Allen liner New York from her moorings. Another disastrous collision seemed inevitable until EJ stopped Titanic dead in the water. It was a close call and regarded as somewhat ominous by the superstitious crew. Chief Officer Henry Wilde, newly transferred from Olympic, wrote to his sister, "I still don't like this ship. I have a queer feeling about it." With the panic over, Titanic sailed down Southampton Water and into Spit Head. Captain Smith, on the bridge with that same Trinity House pilot who had been with him at the Hawke collision, must have been glad to be gaining the open sea at last. Titanic entered Cherbourg Harbour just before sunset that evening. The new tenders, Nomadic and Traffic, ferried out 274 new passengers. Among them a Mrs. Margaret Brown, who would famously go down in history as Unsinkable Molly Brown. At noon the following day, Titanic dropped anchor off Roche's Point at the entrance to Queenstown Harbour, last port of call on her passage to New York. Queenstown has long since reverted to its proper Irish name, Cove, but the Queenstown days are a poignant memory, days when big ships carried millions of young Irish men and women away from their homes, never to return. At least one passenger disembarked Titanic at Queenstown, Father Francis Brown. His uncle was the Bishop of Cloyne, and he presided over his diocese from the newly built St. Colman's Cathedral high above the town. Father Brown, a keen amateur photographer, took the last ever pictures of the Titanic before she sailed into history. To his uncle, the bishop, would fall the sad task of saying the Requiem Mass for the many lost souls of Ireland. Sharp at 1:30, Titanic's steam whistle sounded, and the great ship headed for the open Atlantic. On board, there were now 324 first-class passengers, 285 second, and 706 third. In the engine rooms and stokeholes far below, Chief Engineer Bell had things pretty well under control, except the worrying bunker fire which still burned. He had assigned a small gang of trimmers to empty the bunker of coal and so eventually extinguish the source. It was not going to be a quick and easy job, however. The ship's engines were working up faultlessly. First day out of Queenstown, she ran 386 miles. Second day, 519. Third day, 546. 75 revolutions, 21.5 knots. By the morning of Sunday, the 14th of April, the ship was running at full speed in calm and fair weather. At 9 a.m., an ice warning was received from the Cunarder Caronia, and over the next few hours, more warnings came in from the Baltic, the America, the Californian, and the Mesaba. Each report placed the ice directly ahead of Titanic's track, but still the ship drove on at full speed. At 9:30 p.m., the lookouts in the crow's nest were told to watch out for icebergs. An hour later, the sea temperature was down to 31 degrees. A passing ship was sighted heading east, the cargo steamer Rappahannock. Her signal lamp began to flash a message to Titanic. Have just passed through heavy field ice and several icebergs. Clearly, the danger lay directly ahead. Titanic replied, "Message received. Thank you. Good night." Then continued on her way at full speed. One final attempt to alert Titanic to the extreme danger ahead was made by the Californian at 11 p.m. Sadly, the message got no further than the Marconi room, where it was rudely interrupted. "Keep out! Shut up! You're jamming my signal. I'm working Cape Race." The stage was now set for disaster. A mere 40 minutes later, lookout Fred Fleet, high in the crow's nest, sighted an iceberg dead ahead. First Officer William Murdoch, in charge of the watch, ordered the helm hard a starboard and swung the engine room telegraph to full astern. But it was too late. The ship struck the ice a glancing blow on the starboard bow. Murdoch closed all the watertight doors, and the carpenter was called to sound the ship. It took less than 20 minutes to assess the extent of the damage. The forward 6 compartments were flooding rapidly. Tom Andrews did some quick calculations and told Captain Smith that Titanic had no more than 2 hours to live. Just after midnight, the order was given to prepare the boats and muster the passengers and crew. The senior wireless operator, Jack Phillips, began tapping out the international distress call, CQD. The Frankfurt replied, then the Mount Temple, the Carpathia, and the Olympic. Later he tried the new signal, SOS. 45 minutes later, the first boat was ready to be lowered. It was a little over half full. Titanic was well down by the head, and lifeboats started to leave the ship at regular intervals. The band assembled on the boat deck and were playing ragtime. The last boat to be lowered left at 2:05, full now, as the tragedy reached its finale. Just before 2:20 a.m., the stern rose for the final plunge. The lights failed, and moments later, she was gone. 712 survivors were picked up by the Cunard steamer Carpathia just before dawn that morning. 1,502 people had perished in the ice-cold waters of the North Atlantic. 3 weeks after the sinking, the Board of Trade opened its official inquiry into the circumstances of the wreck. It lasted for 36 days, the longest wreck inquiry in history, and during its course, some 98 witnesses were asked a total of over 25,000 questions. The president of the commission was Lord Mersey of Toxteth, a recently retired High Court judge. It might well be supposed that such an exhaustive inquiry left no stone unturned in its search for the truth. In fact, it was a complete whitewash, and largely concocted to get the Board of Trade off the hook. They were in a very embarrassing position. They had permitted Titanic to sail, with a certificate for 3,500 passengers, but with lifeboat accommodation for only 1,175, less than 1/3. In fact, their hopelessly out-of-date rules only required Titanic to carry 16 lifeboats. The White Star Line were quick to point out that they had exceeded this requirement. 16 boats under davits and a further 4 collapsible boats stowed inboard. Both parties were being disingenuous. The Board of Trade rules, which hadn't been revised in 18 years, grouped passenger ships by tonnage rather than the number of passengers carried. And if this wasn't ludicrous enough, the upper limit for the classification system was for ships of 10,000 tons and above. But Titanic was over 46,000 tons, more than 4 times the size of the board's highest class. White Star were well aware of this anomaly, but did little or nothing to correct it. As they were complicit in the paucity of life-saving provisions, their passengers might at least have expected cautious and prudent navigation, but the White Star Line was equally gung-ho in this matter. Captain E.J. Smith, true to form, sailed headlong into a known danger area at full speed and with less than adequate lookout. Ernest Shackleton, the famous Antarctic explorer, was called to give evidence and was asked his opinion on navigation in the proximity of ice.
What I want you to tell my lord is, do you think it is of advantage in clear weather to have a man stationed right ahead of the stem as well as in the crow's nest?
Undoubtedly, when you're in the danger zone, the ice zone.
And supposing you were passing through a zone where ice had been reported to you, would you take precautions as to the lookouts? Supposing you only had men in the crow's nest, Would you take any other precautions?
I would take the ordinary precaution of slowing down, whether I was in a ship equipped for ice or any other, compatible with keeping steerage way for the size of the ship.
You would slow down?
I would slow down, yes.
And supposing you were going 21 to 22 knots, I suppose that would be the better reason for slowing down?
You have no right to go at that speed in an ice zone.
It might be supposed that this damning evidence alone from so expert a witness would have condemned the White Star. But no, like the Board of Trade itself, they wriggled off the hook. Lord Mersey concluded that the fate which befell Titanic, which was hopelessly under-equipped with lifeboats and was slammed into an iceberg at full speed, resulting in the deaths of 1,522 people, was an accident that was neither foreseeable, nor the fault of the government agency which certified her, nor of the company which operated her. So who was to blame for the catastrophic loss of life? Mersey concluded that it was Captain Stanley Lord, master of the Leyland liner Californian. By cannibalizing and cherry-picking largely circumstantial evidence, the Board of Trade Inquiry decided that Lord's ship was in clear sight of the stricken Titanic, but made no attempt to go to her assistance. Stanley Lord was the only individual to be censured by the court, and it was his ruin. The discovery of the wreck of Titanic, more than 7 decades later, was to finally establish that Lord was entirely innocent. His evidence, as given in 1912, was correct. His ship was more than 19 miles away, far too far away to see or be seen from Titanic. For Stanley Lord, this vindication came too late. He died in January 1962. The Board of Trade Inquiry might have let the White Star Line off the hook, but in 1913 an Irishman, Thomas Ryan, brought a civil action against the company for the loss of his son, a third-class passenger. The judgment handed down in the High Court of Justice was to finally damn the White Star Line. The navigation of Titanic was judged to be negligent. The appalling consequences of the sinking of Titanic shook the British shipping industry to its foundations. For the White Star Line, it was a potential death blow. Olympic was loading at Southampton a few days after the disaster when the entire complement of firemen and trimmers, the so-called Black Gang, walked off the ship, refusing to return until sufficient lifeboats were put on board. White Star management blustered and threatened the men with charges of mutiny, but in the end they cancelled the voyage and gave in. More boats were provided. 5 more round trips to New York were completed that summer of 1912. Then Olympic returned to Belfast for very major alterations. The cellular double bottom was extended upwards to 4 feet above the load line, and the bulkheads were also extended upwards, some by as much as 40 feet. The result of this refit was a ship which could now remain afloat with 6 compartments flooded, and one provided with lifeboats for all aboard. Olympic returned to the North Atlantic service in late 1913, and White Star desperately hoped that they could put the Titanic behind them once and for all. The outbreak of the Great European War in August 1914 largely achieved this result. For a while, Olympic continued in commercial service, but a year later she was requisitioned by the Admiralty as a naval transport, armed with 6-inch guns and painted in dazzle camouflage. During her war service, Olympic steamed 184,000 miles and carried over 120,000 passengers, both military and civilian. She became known as the Old Reliable. When the war finally ended, a Belfast trip heralded another big refit and conversion to burn oil rather than coal. Olympic was the first of the big liners to be converted. During the following decade, Olympic enjoyed her golden years. Catering for the elite of the transatlantic trade, this most elegant of ships was a firm favourite among royalty, millionaires, and the new stars of the motion pictures. It seemed that she'd finally lived down the reputation for ill luck which had dogged her early life. and the Titanic connection was largely forgotten. In 1934, the British government forced the financially ailing White Star Line to merge with its arch-rival Cunard. It was a precondition of public funding to save the shipping industry. Cunard had a mammoth new liner on the stocks in Glasgow, and work had stopped for lack of funds. The merger spelled the end of the road for Olympic, which along with Mauritania was one of the first casualties of the fleet rationalisation. In this last year of her active career, Olympic was again involved in a serious collision. She ran down and sank the Nantucket lightship in dense fog. 7 men lost their lives. It was a bad way to finish. The major structural alteration dictated by the Titanic disaster delayed the completion of the third sister for over a year. Britannic wasn't launched until February the 26th, 1914. As well as incorporating all the modifications that had been carried out in Olympic, the new ship was equipped with extraordinary lifeboat provision. Clearly, White Star wanted to be seen to be doing everything possible to avert another disaster. Britannic was still fitting out the following year when she was requisitioned as a hospital ship. The hasty conversion to this role was achieved in 1 month. She sailed almost immediately for Gallipoli, where the ill-conceived Allied landing had faltered with colossal casualties. On November the 21st, 1916, outward bound on her 6th trip to the eastern Mediterranean, Britannic struck a mine recently laid by a German U-boat. The great ship rapidly became totally unmanageable, taking a severe list, and in less than 1 hour had disappeared below a calm Aegean Sea. 29 people lost their lives, but the great majority of those aboard, 1,106 in total, were saved. In the aftermath of the sinking of Britannic, the German government announced that British hospital ships would henceforth be liable to attack. It seems they concluded that Britannic was illegally carrying war material, and that this had caused the massive internal explosions which reportedly followed the detonation of the mine. Certainly, when the French oceanographer Jacques Cousteau located and filmed the wreck in 1976, a gaping hole on the port bow, the plates blown outward, seemed to indicate that something inside the ship had definitely exploded. Looking back at the 3 ships nearly a century later, it is inevitable that the middle sister is best remembered. Titanic is probably the most famous ship in history. But how much of the mythology of Titanic has any basis in truth? Let's examine some of the conventional wisdom. Titanic was the largest moving object ever made by man up to that time. Well, actually, Titanic was exactly the same size as her elder sister, Olympic. Titanic was heralded an unsinkable ship, but neither builder nor owner had ever made such a claim. The idea stemmed from an article in the press which described the Olympic-class ships as practically unsinkable. However, once such an ill-advised claim had been made, White Star did nothing to contradict it. Captain E.J. Smith and his crew were accorded heroic status at the time, especially by the British press, which positively wallowed in a mixture of mawkish sentimentality and self-righteous nationalistic jingoism. The legacy of heroism still persists to this day, but re-examination of the disaster reveals a very different picture. Smith went down with the ship in the best tradition of the service, after extolling his crew to be British, whatever that meant. However, he was really the main culprit in the whole sorry affair. After ignoring ice warnings throughout the day, he gave no instructions to slow down, nor to increase the lookout, as darkness fell and the ice field approached. Instead, he went to dinner with some of the elite of first class. 4th Officer Boxhall worked out the Titanic's position, which was then transmitted by the Marconi men in the general distress call. The accuracy of this position was lauded by Captain Rostron of the Carpathia and taken as an absolute by the Board of Trade Inquiry. But it was wrong. The deck officers were praised for their cool command of the filling and lowering of the lifeboats, preventing panic and ensuring women and children first. But why did it take over 1 hour to launch the first lifeboat? And why did so many of the early boats leave half full? The lifeboats had capacity for 1,178 people, but only 652 people actually left in these boats. Lord Mersey concluded that the third-class passengers had been afforded proper access to the lifeboats, but not a single third-class passenger was called to give evidence. Why were more first-class men saved than third-class children? When it was all over, it became clear that only the dead were heroes. Those who survived would be tainted by Titanic forever. None of the